states of national emergency right now. And what are those 35? Well, let's see if we can get through them all. In November of 1979, loyalists to the new Islamic fundamentalist government in Iran took several dozen Americans hostage at the US Embassy in Tehran. In response, President Jimmy Carter proclaimed a national emergency in order to freeze any Iranian government assets being held in US banks. Of course, in the 40 years since then, a lot of that money has gradually been unfrozen and given back to the Iranians, including on Obama's infamous pallet. In fact, there is even an official American-Iranian Asset Restoration Tribunal now, but still a national emergency. Alright, now let's flash forward to November of 1994. The Cold War is over, and America turns its eyes to a new threat: rogue states acquiring weapons of mass destruction. In November of 1994, President Bill Clinton thus proclaimed a national emergency in order to create some new regulations to stop the proliferation of WMDs. This included prohibiting foreigners from buying things from America that could be used to make WMDs, and imposing financial punishments on any country determined to have an active WMD program. These powers continue to be used by presidents to this day because, unfortunately, despite Bill Clinton's best efforts, WMD proliferation very much continues. In March of 1995, President Clinton proclaimed a national emergency in order to stop American companies from buying Iranian oil. Clinton said this was a way the US could help financially hurt the Iranian regime and stop it from sponsoring terrorism around the world, US relations having not improved much since the Carter years. A few months after that, Clinton proclaimed another national emergency, this time to freeze the US assets of the infamous Cali drug cartel of Colombia. At the time, the Cali cartel were considered responsible for about 80% of the cocaine in the US. Since then, the Cali cartel has been broken up and all of its top guys are in jail, but this national emergency remains on the books just the same. It is now used as a pretext for freezing the US assets of drug traffickers in general. In February of 1996, Cuban-American relations hit a new low. The Cuban Air Force shot down 2 small American civilian planes, which were being piloted by Cuban-American anti-Castro activists who were distributing anti-Castro leaflets over Cuba. President Clinton thus proclaimed a national emergency in order to make a new rule that said that US ships could not enter Cuban waters without first getting US government approval. This rule was softened a bit during the Obama administration, but has since been toughened back up under Trump. Sudan continued to spiral into an increasingly vicious Islamic dictatorship throughout the 1990s under the leadership of the notorious General Bashir. Clinton declared a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on members of his regime. Now, sanctions is a word you're going to be hearing a lot today because it is by far the most common emergency power that presidents use. But what are sanctions? Basically, during a national emergency, a president can pick out any foreigner or foreign organization and freeze any US bank assets they might have, prohibit Americans from doing any business with them, and if it's a person, ban them from ever coming to the United States. By the way, General Bashir was actually overthrown last year, but this state of emergency against his regime remains in place. Okay, now we are on to a new president, George W. Bush. In the late 1990s, there was a terrible civil war in the former Yugoslavia, which ended with the 1999 signing of the Dayton Accords. In 2001, President Bush proclaimed a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on various terrorists who were seen as undermining the fragile peace in that part of the world. Okay, so this is a kind of unique one. US trade law has always had special rules that require Americans to get special permission from the US government before you can sell certain forms of very advanced US technology, like supercomputers, to people in other countries. In 2001, the laws governing this expired, and since Congress didn't pass a new law, President Bush proclaimed a national emergency to just keep all of the rules of the expired law in place. And Congress never did pass a new law, so to this day, the rules governing the export of advanced US technology remain under presidential control. On September 11th, 2001, there was a massive terrorist attack in the United States led by Islamic fundamentalists. 3 days later, on September 14th, President Bush proclaimed a national emergency and evoked all of the emergency war powers granted to the president under the various military-related sections of the US Code. Now, the ways that the Bush administration behaved in the aftermath of 9/11 is obviously this huge and very controversial topic. We don't have time to get into all of that now, but suffice it to say that the September 14th national emergency was probably the most consequential of any of the ones we're going to talk about today. The US has basically been in a permanent state of war footing ever since. 2 weeks after September 11th, President Bush proclaimed a different national emergency in order to impose sanctions on a bunch of Islamic terrorist groups. During the early 2000s, the rule of Zimbabwe's longtime dictator, Robert Mugabe, grew even more vicious and corrupt. President Bush proclaimed a national emergency in 2003 in order to impose sanctions on Mugabe and friends. This declaration remains in place even though Mugabe was overthrown in 2017. In the spring of 2003, the US invaded Iraq and overthrew the regime of dictator Saddam Hussein. The entire Iraqi government was then reconstructed under US and UN authority. And one of the reforms was to create something called the Development Fund for Iraq, which was basically the new Iraqi government's budget. It was mostly funded through seized assets belonging to the old regime, like profits made from the selling of oil or the personal property of Saddam's inner circle. Anyway, in order to prevent any of this from being challenged in the courts, in May of 2003, President Bush proclaimed a national emergency in order to give the Iraqi Development Fund legal immunity as it went about its business. In 2014, President Obama suspended that immunity, but the American government is still helping the Iraqis reclaim assets from the Saddam years to this day. After the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the Bush administration started to really tighten the screws on the government in Syria, in what many saw as being a prelude to an invasion of that country too. In 2004, Bush proclaimed a national emergency to basically ban all American trade and travel with Syria and impose a bunch of sanctions as well. As Syria has only become a more infamous country since then, a lot of these rules have since been tightened up. Saying Syria is triggering Siri. A big part of the Bush administration's foreign policy philosophy was that the US should punish dictatorships wherever they can be found. Accordingly, between 2006 and 2008, President Bush proclaimed 4 different states of national emergency in order to impose sanctions on the regimes in Belarus, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lebanon, and North Korea. The new administration of President Barack Obama continued this trend, declaring a national emergency in 2010 in order to impose sanctions on Somalia, and in 2011, Libya. Though in the case of Libya, sanctioning the regime of Colonel Gaddafi was part of a growing escalation of tension between Libya and the West that eventually culminated in Western airstrikes against the country and the overthrow and death of Colonel Gaddafi himself. In 2016, President Obama revised this emergency declaration to make it apply to the various terrorist groups who had taken over Libya in the aftermath of Gaddafi's downfall. Alrighty, more than halfway done. The Obama administration was keen to make a crackdown on international organized crime one of the hallmarks of their justice agenda. Accordingly, in 2011, President Obama proclaimed a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on the following foreign gangs: the Brothers Circle, the Camorra, Los Zetas, and the Yakuza. In 2011, the so-called Arab Spring broke out, which saw mass public uprisings against various Middle Eastern dictators. One of the various regimes targeted was the president of Yemen, who in 2012 agreed to step down, and the new guy promised to herald a transition to democracy. Obama proclaimed an unusual national emergency around this time, not to sanction anyone specifically, but to reserve the right to sanction anyone that they determined to be threatening the peace, security, or stability of Yemen. This remarkably open-ended decree continues to be useful as the Yemenis continue to wait for that promised peace, security, and stability to arrive. In the spring of 2014, tensions rose between the government of Ukraine and various Russian-backed militia groups over control of the Crimean region. As Ukraine was a US ally, on March 6, 2014, President Obama proclaimed a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on various Russian